Anytime the politicians start talking about education, I start having to listen real carefully. As a teacher, the politicians have a great deal of impact on what I do, and usually negative. And so when I was listening to Obama's speech last night, of course he talked about education, and so I listened carefully on what he was trying to propose, what he was trying to pull off on us. And it seemed as though the bulk of his talk was centered upon two major areas. One, the competitiveness issue, in that in comparison with the other industrialized countries, we seem to be falling behind. Too many dropouts and not enough people completing college. Let me address that first. In the competitive issues, who are we actually losing to? Is it the other industrial nations like Europe or Japan? Or are we getting smoked by what are considered to be the developing nations, like, for example, India? Maybe his comparison, or the comparison that his scriptwriters was trying to create, was not necessarily an honest one. In fact, one of the other major issues he was trying to get across was the need to not only have a high school diploma, but possibly even college. You know, he talks about how the fact that less than half the people who start a college education actually finish it. Well, consider this. Maybe college operates on the Darwin model. I remember when I was in college years ago, I went to a competitive school. It was a state school, but very competitive. In the opening orientation, they would, say, "Welcome to the university," blah, blah. And then they would follow up with, "Look to your right and look to your left. One of you is not going to be here next semester." Maybe colleges are engaged in some weeding process. Not every job requires a college education. In fact, there are probably some jobs that don't even require high school education. Now, I realize that that's heresy within my profession, but let's be honest. What we're developing ourselves up to is a thing called credentialism, where just the fact that you have a sheepskin, whether it be a high school diploma or college or such like that, makes you more important than one who doesn't. Remember, just because you have the piece of paper doesn't necessarily mean you actually know anything. We would hope that you would. But the way these politicians operate, they're more interested in the piece of paper than what it's supposed to represent. What ends up happening is this credentialism, where there's an implication that more education is better, regardless of the fact that what's important is, can you do the job? And there are other points that he makes and such like that. In fact, even this appeal to patriotism, that if you drop out from high school, you're not only harming yourself, but harming the country. In fact, the phrase he used was, you're not just quitting yourself, but quitting your country. That would have been fine if you just left it at quitting yourself, as I'm a big fan of people taking responsibility for themselves. But when you throw in, when you're quitting the country, you're kind of giving the implication that your input is more important to the country than the country maybe to you. It goes back to the old Kennedy thing. Ask not what you can do for what the country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Now, I'm a firm believer in personal responsibility. Let's not depend on the country to save my bacon. I'm not certain that that's their job. And education plays a role in this. In earlier videos, I'd point out that what one does in their education, the paying attention in class, or taking the notes, all those things that we try to get the high school kids to do, it's for their benefit. I mean, let's be blunt. Does it really hurt the teacher if they fail? Unfortunately, it usually does. Because you get parents upset, and you have the administrators upset. And it's just a lot easier to pass the kids along. Which then raises some of the other specters. there's always this need for education reform. Well, here's the problem. When they're talking about education reform, they usually talk about it in several points. One, dealing with the high standards. Well, having high standards is good. I'd like to have high standards. But be aware of this. Not everyone can achieve those standards. Even within education, there's the acknowledgement that people learn at different rates, in different ways. And this whole notion of high standards usually ends up in a bureaucratic cookie cutter situation, where you're given a test, and you either know it or you don't. That doesn't even fly even within education. Not everyone is the same. But yet, for fairness and accountability, well, everyone has to be the same, win or lose. Just doesn't seem to be particularly fair. And there are all kinds of other issues. Keep in mind that most speeches that politicians deliver are written by other people. And so they put in all kinds of neat buzzwords that really don't mean anything. Like, for example, a complete and competitive education. Complete and competitive on what basis? You know, that was one of the problems that occurred historically. Back up until the 50s, a complete education looked at also your ethnicity. And a complete education for the African Americans was considered different than the complete education for the whites. The whole notion of separate but equal was thrown out because a lot of people thought that complete and competitive didn't include the blacks. Now, complete and competitive is all in the eye of the beholder. And we need to be careful, because who actually defines it? As it stands now, they leave a lot of that up to the states. And so you have a mishmash of standards. In my home state, the standards have been set very high, and so we have a large number of people that don't pass the state tests. There are other states where the standards are so low that most everyone passes their tests. I remember, because some of those states got caught by 60 Minutes, because those states and their neighbors didn't always agree. So again, bureaucrats, they're not coming to our rescue. They're just making a bad situation even worse. And there's some other points that Obama put in his speech that I found troubling. And I'll finish off with this one point. Because of the push for college, he also said, if you were to volunteer, help out the community, we'll make the necessary arrangements for you to get higher education. You know, that sounds to me like a veiled threat, saying that, hey, if you want the benefit of college, you're going to have to do something for us. Now, I get into college for my own benefit, not for theirs. And if you put some kind of notion of even an implied compelling of service, you know, a quid pro quo in that way, you open up a whole can of worms. So with all these various thoughts, and there were more thoughts that I had in this, when he talked about innovative programs and new methods and such like that, that was all mumbo jumbo. And actually, probably the makings of another video later. So until then, this is just my view on Obama's speech the other night.